Madam President. I'm here on the floor of the Senate this evening to talk about our shared national priorities for addressing the nation's infrastructure needs and my concerns, really deep concerns, about the plan the Biden administration has outlined, and specifically the way they intend to pay for it. I don't think there's a single member in this chamber who does not recognize the need for us to invest in upgrading America's aging infrastructure. Our network of roads, bridges, ports, railroads, and more have played an integral role over the decades in growing our world-class economy. Yet, according to a 2019 report, the most recent one we have from the World Economic Forum, the United States now ranks only 13th in the world on infrastructure, based on factors like the quality of our roads, how efficient our trains are, and access to electricity and water. So we can and should do more to improve our infrastructure, particularly as competitors like China make substantial investments in their own infrastructure every year. And we can do so in a bipartisan way, just as we have always done. In fact, last Congress, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee approved bipartisan infrastructure legislation by a unanimous vote of 21-0. That was just last Congress, 21-0. This bipartisan approach last Congress totaled $287 billion, a substantial amount, and one we had yet to figure out how to pay for. The current transportation bill that's in place, the so-called infrastructure bill from a few years ago, is about $310 billion. Yet even as we have to figure out how to fund the bipartisan $287 billion package for roads and bridges from last year, a substantial amount in its own right, the Biden administration recently introduced its own infrastructure plan that totals $2.7 trillion, almost 10 times as much. At the core of this Biden administration proposal is $620 billion in infrastructure broadly defined. It's a generous definition of roads and bridges and other physical transportation and water components that have traditionally been considered infrastructure. So a generous definition would be that out of the $2.7 trillion, $620 billion could be called infrastructure, based on the way Republicans and Democrats alike have always looked at it. And again, that would include water, electricity, other forms of transportation, not just roads and bridges. So about 20% of the Biden administration infrastructure bill actually fits the bill. The reason the overall package costs $2.7 trillion is because they have included a broad set of liberal priorities that are a far cry from what has ever been defined as infrastructure by either Democrats or Republicans. So I guess knowing the popularity of infrastructure, and it is popular, people want to see their roads and bridges repaired, the Biden administration has simply redefined the word to include hundreds of billions of dollars of spending on priorities like health care, federal office buildings and other facilities, research and development, electric vehicle manufacturers, and more. According to the Biden administration, paid leave is now infrastructure. Child care is now infrastructure. Caregiving is now infrastructure. While many are worthy causes and should be debated and voted on separately, they don't belong in infrastructure bills. This approach is troubling to me, and I know to many of my colleagues, some on both sides of the aisle, because it's a continuation of the raw partisanship that defined the latest COVID-19 spending package back in March. Rather than work to find good faith negotiations with Republicans to craft a package that could gain bipartisan support, the Biden administration and Senate Democrats apparently are once again looking into potentially using reconciliation to jam Republicans, to pass another trillion-plus spending bill with a simple 50-vote majority. And like COVID-19, infrastructure has always been bipartisan. So if you can't be bipartisan on COVID-19 and you can't be bipartisan on infrastructure, what can you be bipartisan about? This partisan approach, by the way, is the opposite of what President Biden pledged on the campaign trail and in his inauguration address. In his inaugural address, he talked about the need to get back to more bipartisanship and urged unity. I agreed with that assessment and said so at the time. Unfortunately, he has apparently listened to the more strident voices in his party and has gone down the partisan path. As with the $1.9 trillion COVID spending package last March, the end result could be another spending bill that is far higher than it needs to be at a time of record debt and deficits, and another partisan bill that further divides us at a time when we are already too divided. In fact, about a quarter of the Biden plan is not paid for at all, taking us further into debt. But even more troubling to me is that the Democrats plan to pay for roughly $2 trillion of this plan with massive tax increases on American workers and consumers, and by making us less competitive in the global economy. This would completely reverse the progress we've made over the past few years in making America competitive again. Thanks to the 2017 tax reforms that the Biden proposal would largely dismantle, in the couple of years before COVID-19, we saw record growth in jobs and wages, with the lowest poverty rate since the federal government started keeping track of it 60 years ago. In promoting the Biden tax increases, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen claims we need to reverse the 2017 tax reforms because they encouraged businesses to move jobs out of the country. The reality is just the opposite. The 2017 tax reforms stopped the so-called corporate tax inversions, which caused American companies to become foreign companies and move jobs and investment out of America because of our uncompetitive tax laws. This happened to a number of companies in Ohio and in every state practically represented in this chamber. The 2017 reforms also stopped the lockout effect that kept foreign profits of U.S. companies overseas. They weren't bringing the profits back. Instead, $1.6 trillion in overseas earnings has come back to the United States and was invested right here at home. Most importantly for working families, 70% of the savings from the corporate tax cuts went into workers' wages, contributing to 19 straight months of wage growth of over 3% annually that we enjoyed before the pandemic. This wage growth was really welcome in my home state of Ohio, where we'd had lower wages or flat wages for more than a decade. And by the way, who benefited most from this wage increase, 19 straight months of wage increases? Lower and middle income workers. Exactly what should have been happening. Thanks to the 2017 reforms, the largest U.S. companies also increased their domestic research and development expenditures by 25%, which amounts to $707 billion more R&D. And they further increased capital expenditures by 20%, aided by this return of foreign profits. All of this U.S. investment, job creation, and new R&D would be put at risk by these proposed tax hikes. Under the Biden plan, which we've heard is raising the corporate rate from 21% to 28%, in actuality, the combined federal and state corporate rate would go from 25.8%, where it is now, when you include the state and federal. Other countries like China don't have any state income tax on their corporations. They just have the federal rate. So we'd be going from 25.8%, by the way, which is already above the average of 23.4% for other developed countries, so-called OECD countries. It would go from 25.8% up to a staggering 32.8%, the highest rate in the developed world. Our tax rate would once again be higher than China's and higher than any country in the developed world, Japan, Europeans. This is exactly what we got away from in 2017, and it's what, on a bipartisan basis, there was a consensus for us to do. Maybe not the exact rate, but the idea was to make America competitive again. I co-chaired a task force with a fellow senator, a Democrat from across the aisle, Chuck Schumer, on the Finance Committee, and we came up with this idea of saying, let's go to a territorial-type tax system and let's lower the rate so that we can be competitive around the world. And it's what happened, and it's working. And now, for some reason, the Biden administration says we want to reverse all that. These abrupt tax hikes, which actually would be 5 times as large as the corresponding corporate tax cuts in 2017, would make our workers and our businesses less competitive globally at a time when our economy is just starting to recover. The Biden plan goes well beyond just making our tax rates uncompetitive again. It also doubles the tax on so-called global intangible low-tax income, or GILTI, making it more costly for U.S. companies to operate outside the United States, more costly than any other companies of any developed country in the world. Again, it puts us at a competitive disadvantage. It unfairly punishes American workers who have their jobs here in America supporting international operations. In Ohio, for example, we have Procter & Gamble. It's headquartered in my hometown. They rely on overseas production to serve foreign markets in an affordable manner. They're not going to ship diapers from here overseas because it's not cost competitive. So for the foreign markets, they'll make diapers in those foreign countries. However, by doing so, they employ thousands of Ohioans and others around this country who support those international sales. So all the back office work, the sales work, the research and development and so on is done here. The proposed Biden tax increases would make such companies uncompetitive overseas, resulting in us losing markets there and losing U.S. jobs. And remember, no other developed country in the world does this except us. No other country taxes these companies on their foreign profits. We got away from that on purpose, and we essentially established a minimum tax, which, again, hardly any country in the world has, but we wanted to have some balance here. Now, under this proposal from the Biden administration, that tax would be more than doubled. It's going to hurt us. The Biden administration also proposes to eliminate a provision regarding what's called Foreign-Derived Intangible Income, FDII. In 2017, we put FDII in place for a very simple reason, and there seemed to be a consensus about that, which is to provide a carrot to U.S. companies to do their research and development here in America. It incentivized companies to bring that research back and to keep that research here. It worked to create high-skill and high-wage jobs. For example, Google, Cisco, Facebook brought all of their intellectual property home, all of their IP home. And we hear from other U.S. companies like Intel and Disney who say they kept their IP in the United States due to this tax law change. Why would we want that to go overseas? The Biden administration claims that it wants the United States to be more competitive, yet these proposed tax increases do just the opposite. It makes no sense that while China and other countries are increasing subsidies to businesses that innovate, the United States would be punishing our workers and global companies, making them less competitive. In what amounts to an astounding admission of how deeply flawed these proposals are, when Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced the proposal to increase taxes we've just talked about, she actually went out of her way to make a plea to other countries around the world. She asked them to raise their own corporate tax rates, to increase their own taxes, to ensure, as she said, a more level playing field. Understanding the nature of the intense global competition, our competitors are doing just the opposite. It's naive to think that because we're going to raise our taxes and ask them to do the same, that they would do that. They want more of the jobs and investment in their country. In fact, just this past week, the finance minister of Ireland, when asked about this, said no, they have no interest in raising taxes. And Ireland is one of those countries that's made themselves competitive and resulted in our tax law changes because they were taking jobs away from us. And now we were bringing this IP and these jobs back. Ireland, China, these other countries, they're going to continue to lower barriers to attract capital and jobs. It's wishful thinking at best to think because we're going to raise our taxes, they're going to raise theirs. The Biden plan would mean America standing alone atop the corporate tax rate chart among all developed countries, standing alone, leaving our businesses and workers to suffer the costs. A fact borne out from multiple studies, including from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, that shows that it is workers who bear most of the burden of higher taxes in the form of lower wages and lost jobs. It's not the corporations, it's the workers. As I said before, there's a clear need for us to reinvest in American infrastructure. I think we can all agree at that. Republicans and Democrats alike want to do it, and right now in the key committee of jurisdiction, by the way, the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee, bipartisan negotiations are ongoing. This is the same committee that had a unanimous vote last Congress on the transportation legislation. They're talking right now about how to put together a bipartisan package. That's the right way to do it. Go through regular order. Allow Democrats and Republicans alike to offer their ideas. There's also a group of Republicans and Democrats outside of the committee who have met and are looking for a more sensible way forward. I'm among that group. There are others as well. The partisan approach by the Biden administration looks to be taking us down the road of another $1 trillion-plus spending package jammed through Congress with no support from the other side of the aisle. That's not good for this institution. It's not good for this country. It's not the way to get things done. Instead of a $2.7 trillion plan that goes way beyond any reasonable definition of infrastructure and is mostly paid for with a devastating tax hike on U.S. workers and our economy, let's do what we know works. A bipartisan approach focused on what we have all agreed is infrastructure: roads, bridges, ports, rail, broadband, other true infrastructure. I believe if we take that more targeted approach, we can build on the bipartisan frameworks this Congress has achieved in recent years and work together to find common sense ways to fund infrastructure legislation, including user fees, which is what we've always used in the past, without resorting to partisan tax hikes, which reduce the competitiveness of U.S. workers, U.S. companies, and undermine investment in our country. I hope we take that better approach. I yield back my time.